Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Petty, and I first would like to welcome you on this wonderful, splendid afternoon day. I would also like to thank you for coming out for this town hall meeting. Secondly, I have gotten the distinct honor to introduce to you today someone that really doesn't need to be introduced. In fact, he's very popular in our polling areas. So with a great deal of satisfaction and honor, I would like to present to you this afternoon our most recent elected United States Senator of Illinois, Senator Barack Obama.
Thank you. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. What a nice reception. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Well, what a great turnout. And I feel bad making this much noise in a library. I used to get kicked out of libraries all the time, chewing gum, whispering to my friends. So it's good to see all of you, and thanks to the Peoria Public Library for hosting us. Jackie, thanks for the fine introduction. There are a couple of people I want to introduce before I get started. We got Carol Maulding and Bob Black from the Peoria Public Libraries. Where are our librarians? There we go. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful facility. Everybody use your library and return your books after you checked them out. I want to acknowledge James Polk, State Central Committee. Democratic State Central Committee is here. There's James. We have a couple of city council members, Gary Sandberg and Billy Spears. There's Billy, Gary. And we've got Circuit Clerk Bobby Spears, who looks a little like Billy. And we've got Martha Ross from the Peoria School Board. So thank you so much for all of you for taking the time to be here. This is going to be hopefully just the first of many town hall meetings that I host here in the Peoria area. Obviously, it's been very recent that I was elected, and I haven't even been sworn in yet. I don't have an office and don't have any phones for constituent service, so some of this is going to be a little bit more impromptu than it will be hopefully later on when I've got staff and people here who can service specific requests that people have. But I wanted to make sure to come out early. First of all, to say thanks to those of you who voted for me for the great honor of being able to serve this greatest state in the country, the state of Illinois. I appreciate very much your support. For those of you who did not vote for me, I thank you for coming today so that you can share with me your concerns and issues because I want to recognize that after an election, a candidate represents all people. And partisan politics is set aside, and it's time for us to get busy in terms of addressing some of the issues and problems that we face in the country. And so that's my intention. I had a wonderful meeting across the street with Congressman Ray LaHood this morning to talk about how we could work together in order to improve the lives of people in Peoria. I'm going to be having meetings all across the state with individuals. And I've started to have conversations with people nationally. I talked to the president last week when he called to congratulate me, and we had a nice chat about how we could move forward on some important issues, and have been talking to both Democrats and Republicans on how we can make progress. Now, the only caution that I think I want to send to everybody is that progress on the important issues that we care about, whether it's education or jobs or health care, is not going to happen overnight. And so I think, what I tried to be very clear about during the campaign was that I've got a set of principles that guide me, and a belief that people who are able and willing to work should be able to find a job that pays a living wage, a belief that people shouldn't be bankrupt when they get sick, a belief that every child should have a good education and they should all be able to go to college even if they're not wealthy, a belief that senior citizens should be able to retire with some dignity and some respect. And those are the principles that guide me. Now, we put forward some very specific policy proposals in terms of how we could move things forward. For example, I proposed that we roll back tax cuts to the top 1% and use that money to provide health insurance to children and workers who have lost their jobs. We proposed that we change how the student loan program works so that more money goes into Pell Grants for students who are seeking a college education. We talked about providing tax credits to small businesses so that they could potentially provide health insurance to their uninsured workers. So we had a lot of specific proposals. I will be introducing much of this legislation over the next several years in Washington. But it may be that some of the proposals that I put forward, President Bush doesn't agree with me on, or Bill Frist, the head of the Senate, doesn't agree with me on. And I'm going to be in the minority party. So many of the initiatives that we move forward, I will be putting out there, but people have to understand that we're going to have to arrive at compromise in order to achieve and accomplish some of these things. And my first job is to make sure that I'm framing the debate in accordance with the principles that I've set forward, and it may take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years before we actually get some relief on some of these issues. But I'm not going to stop talking about them because I think you never get anything done unless you've put some ideas forward and you can start bringing a coalition of people together around those issues. So with that, what I'd like to do is actually just shut up for a second, let people ask questions, and I'm just going to respond to the questions. Just a couple of ground rules, if you don't mind. To the extent that you're making a statement or a question, I want to be able to accommodate as many people as possible, so try to keep it a little bit brief. If you end up having a particular concern that relates to you personally, what I may do is I may suggest that you talk to me after the meeting so that we're not taking up everybody else's time, and I can then refer you to a staff person, and we'll take down notes and make sure to get back to you with an answer. And the final thing is that I want to give everybody a chance to ask a question, so if you've asked a question and I've answered it, I'm going to move on to somebody else, and then if nobody else has any more questions and you decide you want to ask a second or a third one, then we'll go ahead. All right? So go ahead. Fire away. You've got your senator-elect right in front of you. Yes, sir.
A lot of us saw Fahrenheit 9/11. The first scene in the movie was the attempt to challenge the Florida electors. They couldn't get a single U.S. senator to back the 14 congressmen who were going to oppose the electors and debate them in Congress.
Right.
And this year, there's still evidence in Ohio and also in New Mexico of vote fraud. And there's an article by Greg Palast on TomPaine.com saying Kerry won. And there's an article by the Free Press in Columbus, Ohio, saying none dare call it voter suppression and fraud. So I'll give you these articles from the internet. But there are evidence of significant vote fraud in Ohio and in New Mexico. And if you get a chance in Congress to oppose the electors, I hope you take that opportunity, because it's very embarrassing. None of the Democratic senators last time around stood up to the Florida electors, only 14 Congress people.
Well, let me say this. I don't expect that there's going to be a challenge to the electors this time out. So that's, I don't think, going to be an issue that I confront. What I will say is that 4 years ago we had problems in Florida with respect to making sure all the votes were counted. We had 4 years to repair the system. We did not move aggressively and quickly in repairing the system. One of the things that I am interested in doing is making sure that we investigate how this campaign was conducted, and we start moving more effectively towards making sure that everybody's franchise is secured. Because, frankly, the money that was supposed to be allocated for buying new equipment, training judges, so forth and so on, has not been forthcoming. And that's something that I'm going to take very seriously when I get to Washington. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the man who's going to replace you in the Illinois.
Oh, in the Illinois Senate. Well, he's a young... the question was, wanted to know who was going to replace me in the Illinois Senate. He's representing the south side of Chicago as I did. His name is Kwame Raoul. I guess the requirement is that if you want to represent this district, you got to have a name nobody can pronounce. So I don't know how that happened, but he's an attorney. He works for the community college system in Illinois. He seems like a very fine young man, and I didn't have much to do with the selection of my replacement. I didn't think that was appropriate. I thought it's best left to local officials there, but I think that he will conduct himself well, and I think that he has a progressive agenda as I do. Yes.
With mental health issues, they wind up getting arrested on misdemeanors. They wind up at the county jails. They're mistreated. They don't get their medications. They wind up in the court systems when there could be CIT programs put in place where the police officers, when they pick them up, can be recognized that they have a mental health problem, be taken to the hospitals, get the treatment that they need instead of being brought out to the jails, and get the proper help that they need. And also we have, the problems where they need to get insured, they need to get the treatment that they need. What can be done to help these people with these problems?
Well, this is an ongoing and important problem. One of the things that I think practitioners in the field have recognized, but it hasn't always translated into policy, is that oftentimes the people that we see on the streets, homeless persons, many of them need not only housing, but they need mental health services as well. And mental health services are provided in a very patchwork fashion. Reimbursement levels oftentimes are a problem. And so I've, at the state level, tried to make sure that we put more resources into mental health, particularly in certain populations that aren't adequately served. Now, I will tell you that because of the enormous budget crunch that we're under right now with a $500 billion deficit, I'm not overly optimistic about huge infusions of new money from the federal government for mental health services. What I would like to see, though, is that we re-examine the resources that are already being devoted, because if, for example, we can put together programs in which law enforcement works together with mental health agencies, and some of the money that may be going through the court system or law enforcement is allocated to preventive services on the front end, then we may have a more efficient system. And how much of that can be done at the federal level versus initiatives at the state level is something that I'll try to find out. My suspicion is that probably we need some creative work at the state level, cooperation between local law enforcement officials and the Department of Human Services here at the state, and perhaps the federal government may have some role in terms of making sure that these services are properly reimbursed under existing law and existing programs. Okay. Yes.
Michael Wilson, congratulations on your election.
Thank you very much.
What lessons do you think the Democratic Party can learn from the way you were able to reach out to people across the state? Several of our friends, or my friends, were understandably disappointed last week, and we're sitting around trying to figure out what strategies the Democratic Party either missed or didn't apply in ways that maybe we should have.
Good. So the question was, what should the Democrats be thinking about now as they move forward? I think that there are a couple of components to the question. First, John Kerry ran against the best political operation known to man. I mean, Karl Rove is extraordinarily smart, and they ran a great campaign, and they deserve congratulations for that. John Kerry was also running against a personally popular president during wartime, and that's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, in no other circumstance has a challenger even come close to defeating an incumbent during wartime. And so it's not surprising that it was an uphill battle the entire way. Having said that, I think the Democrats have made some mistakes that, if not corrected, could be a problem long term. I think that mistake number one is that the Democratic Party is best when it's perceived to be on the side of the people and against special interests. Now, that doesn't mean being anti-business. It just means that when choices come down the pike in terms of looking out for ordinary citizens, the Democratic Party does best when it's the champion for ordinary working folks. And I think that sometimes the Democratic Party is ambivalent because they get a lot of campaign money from special interests. And so it's very hard for them to make a populist economic argument against Republican policies if they themselves are ambivalent about whether or not to be populist. So there needs to be some clarity about what we stand for. And it's not enough to just run against somebody. You got to stand for something. And I think that at the national level, all too often, the Democratic Party spends a lot of time saying how bad Bush is or the Republican Congress is, but not being very clear in terms of what its policy prescriptions or its larger narrative, its vision for the country is. The second thing, which has been talked about a lot, and I think is partly true, is that for a long time, the Democrats had a tendency to ignore issues of faith and family because they felt that if they talked about those issues, then they would seem intolerant. I mean, there's a streak in the National Democratic Party that equates religion with intolerance. And that's understandable because there have been intolerant elements in the religious right. But if you just abandon the field and you don't talk about faith and family and community, well, that's where most of us live. Most of us attend church or synagogue or mosque. Most of us care deeply about our families and keeping those families intact, not just in economic terms, but also in terms of relationships and moral terms. And if we're not talking about those issues, then people may feel that the Democratic Party doesn't care about those things. And, and that's how the Republicans have characterized or caricatured the Democrats. Now, I don't think that's, obviously I don't think it's the case, but that, I think, requires us to be much more clear about the moral elements to being a Democrat. When I open my Bible, I see a lot more in there about poverty than I do about gay marriage. And yet, somehow, the perception is that if you're Christian, your number one priority is gay marriage, as opposed to making sure that we don't have, children and families that are suffering. But you have to talk about it in those terms in order for people to see those connections. And I think that's something that we haven't done as successful as we need to. So, yeah, in the back.
Although Illinois has done better than the majority of states, what do you think can be done with the No Child Left Behind, since that was a fairly bipartisan effort, since the majority of states are failing to meet the federal mandates?
Well, it's a terrific question. I think that there are a couple of things that we probably need to focus on. Number one, I think that how we measure progress in the schools should be tinkered with a little bit, because what the No Child Left Behind did was to set some absolute guideposts for achievement, and if you didn't achieve them, then you were a failure. What it didn't take into account is that, for example, schools with a high proportion of low-income children are going to start off a little bit behind. And a teacher may do a terrific job with children who are behind and get them from reading at the first grade level to reading at the second grade level or the second and a half grade level. But if they're in third grade, they may still not hit the mark that's been set. So it doesn't make sense for us not to recognize progress, and we should probably think about what those progress measures are. And the second thing is, if we make promises about what local school districts need to do, then we need to fund those promises. We shouldn't say, have a teacher who's highly qualified in the subject that he or she is teaching in every classroom, knowing that in Illinois, for example, 80% of the school districts are in deficit spending, and the only way to get more teachers is to spend more money. But that isn't to say that money alone is the answer. I mean, I think that the problems of education, as I've said before, are a mix of lack of resources, lack of innovation and creativity, and it's also a needed change in attitude among all American parents and their children about what it's going to take to compete in this global economy. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm going to be on your left.
Spotted.
When you get to Washington, would you help correct some mistaken notions, or even before you get to Washington, and some terrible distortions and misperceptions that there's only one group of evangelicals in America? There's a conservative, mainline, white evangelical community, and then there's a black evangelical community. And we want the country to know that we didn't vote, most black evangelicals didn't vote for Bush. Right. Remember, they are black evangelicals, right, and they're involved in bringing us together rather than further polarizing us. Right. Because we learned a long time ago, back in the 60s, that when we were on the front line of the civil rights struggle, right, the white mainline evangelical conservative community chose to sit it out. Right. They were not there for us. Right. The only people who helped us was the so-called white liberal church. Right. Right. So help us out with that. There are black evangelical Christians.
Oh, not only are they out there, but they supported my campaign, so I know them. Amen. Amen. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Senator, there's a perception that the budget is out of control. And the irony is you've got a so-called conservative Republican president who has taken just the opposite tack of Everett Dirksen and conservative Republicans of a generation gone by. Realistically, what do you think you can do with some other new senators who are coming to the Senate to bring about a new mentality of trying to enforce some fiscal discipline and sanity in the government? And have you thought about, is it a possibility that you really can cut the deficit in half in 2, 3, 4 years?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I am not optimistic about cutting the deficit in any serious way, given the policies that are being presented and were presented during the campaign. Now, that doesn't mean that President Bush doesn't have a change of heart. One of the things about being a second-term president is you'll never run another campaign again. And as a consequence, hopefully that liberates you to start thinking in terms of the long-term legacy of this country. But, yeah, the math of it is pretty simple. We've got a $500 billion a year deficit. And we've got a war that conservatively is going to cost us $75 billion a year, above and beyond our existing defense appropriations. Probably will cost closer to 100, but let's just say conservatively 75 billion. That, according to the press, is what the president's going to request. You then have the administration saying that it's going to make all the tax cuts permanent, including those tax cuts to the top 1%. And when you put all those things together, it's just very hard to conceive of how you significantly cut this deficit. unless we go through the kind of economic growth that was higher than what we experienced in the 90s, because we're in a bigger hole right now. So, you know, I'm not wildly optimistic about it. Now, what I'm going to try to do is partner with more traditional Republicans who are fiscal hawks to see if we can get some sensible accounting of these issues. Now, the other thing I'm worried about, by the way, is President Bush's proposal for privatizing Social Security. I think some of you are aware of the fact that in order to pull off what he's talking about, you've got to come up with another $1 trillion in transition costs. What those are the costs, since my Social Security dollar doesn't go to my account, but it goes to help pay for current retirees, if I start siphoning off some of my money into private accounts just for me, then we got to figure out who's making up that difference. If the only way that it's being done is by just tacking that on to our debt, which seems to be what's implied. I was on Meet the Press and on this week with George Stephanopoulos, and a couple of the Republicans said, well, we're going to maybe try to set up offline accounts. I don't know what that meant, except for the fact that you've got a debt that's sitting out there. So this is something that I'm hopeful that you end up getting some bipartisan movement on. But I can't say that I'm wildly optimistic about it. Okay. That young lady back there, you've just been raising your hand the whole time.
My name is Lorraine B. Carter, and I'm the president of the Martin Warren Southside Neighborhood Association. And I work with the city manager's First Solutions Group and First District Solutions Group. And the question I have is this. The neighborhoods in the older part of Peoria and other cities are having trouble with slum landlords. These slum landlords are destroying our neighborhoods. And I want to know, what can you do to strengthen laws against slum landlords?
Well, you know, it's an excellent question. This is one of those questions where I'm probably going to have to say not much. And the reason is not because I don't care deeply about it. I started my career in public service as a community organizer working on tenant issues, and so I'm very familiar with them. But most of the laws that govern landlords, tenants, you know, how they function, buildings, etc., those are all done at the local level. So I would suggest, I normally don't pass the buck, but there are a couple of city council members who are here. And I would suggest you talk to them because most of those things are done by, you know, local ordinance. You know, usually that's probably going to be the city of Peoria that has jurisdiction over those issues. And if you don't feel like building codes or sort of landlord-tenant relations are being regulated properly, or how, you know, city planning proceeds, that's something that you've got to direct there. Okay? Yes, sir.
I have a couple of just practical suggestions that you might be able to get a bipartisan movement in Illinois. One would be mandating biodiesel in all public transportation, like buses and stuff. And if there's a cost that needs to be offset, it can come out of farm subsidies, because biodiesel would directly help soybean farmers. And the second thing is, I see that my wife travels a lot, and we fly out of the Peoria Airport. We like that, but it seems to me that we need high-speed rails to link Peoria Airport to O'Hare, and they can travel down the interstates, so there'll be right-of-ways. And it looks like the problem with transportation on rail is the government owns the trains, and the private companies own the tracks. And the government should own the tracks and lease the trains to, like, the airline carriers. And then if you link from those regional airports, downtown Peoria, and then from O'Hare to downtown Chicago, you can make it so more people can move out to little towns like I'm from Elmwood, and still be able to get downtown Chicago to do a job and things like that. And we get growth in the areas where the school populations are.
Well, I think that's an excellent suggestion, and you know, I've been a big fan of high-speed rail, particularly with what's happening in terms of fuel costs. The airlines are getting hammered. At some point, they're going to have to raise ticket prices, which is going to further isolate the ability for people to travel effectively. And given the security issues that we go through today, if we had high-speed rail, it'd be faster to take the train than fly to Milwaukee from Chicago, or to Detroit, or some St. Louis, some of the other areas even outside of the state. So I'm a big fan of it. Part of what needs to happen is that local governments, and particularly the state of Illinois, I think has to say that this is something that they're seriously concerned about, because typically state governments make a determination as to what their priorities are, and then the federal government provides the funding for those priorities. But I think we need to recognize that as in love as we are with our cars, that it is not going to be possible for us to simply drill our way out of the energy problems that we have, because there just aren't that many, there aren't enough reserves there. And we can put it off by drilling in Alaska, or doing other things that are environmentally bad. But it doesn't solve the long-term problem, it just puts it off. And right now we've got, we got a national security interest, as well as a environmental interest, as well as an economic interest in improving our basic efficiencies in terms of how we move people and goods about. And I think high-speed rail should be part of that formula. Yes, sir.
Knowing the importance of Senate committees, which ones are you either considering or being considered for in running? Because that's really where your power is going to reside.
Well, I probably won't know until next week what my possibilities are, because with the Democrats losing some seats, the number of seats available in each committee may change. The ratios between Republicans and Democrats may change on each committee. And if that's the case, then there may be certain committees that I would love to have but just won't have. I can tell you that generally my interest has been to be on one committee that's focused on tax policy issues and trade policy issues and money issues. One committee that's focused on foreign affairs, whether that's armed services or foreign relations or the intelligence committee, just because those issues are not going to go away anytime soon. And then one issue that deals very directly with the needs of Illinois, whether that's agriculture or transportation, or a committee like that that allows us to work on these kinds of projects that have some concrete specific benefit to the economic development of Illinois. Yeah, you've been waiting.
Senator Obama, I saw you during the campaign, and I wanted to make a comment today. During the campaign, I asked a question of you. I asked you if you remembered Roots. Thought you were too young. And you said you did. And I said, do you remember at the end when they hold the baby and they say, are you the one, Jimmy? Are you the one?
That's what Oprah said to me. She did.
My other costume today. But I wanted to tell you that I know the answer. And you are the one.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I got to go back and check that movie out. She wasn't a plant. The young lady back there.
What is your stand on deadbeat parents?
Well, I admit that my stand is not as controversial as my opponents in this past race, who thought that they should be flogged. But it comes pretty close. I was raised for a long time by a single mom, and so I know how hard it is for single moms to raise kids without support. And, I think it is very important for us to put in place systems that allow us to track down deadbeat parents, and after fair due process, to garnish their wages, or to secure mechanisms by which they have to pay. Now, the state of Illinois has had a miserable record in terms of how it runs its system. And, you know, we have gone around and around in circles on this. There was this big contract that was given out in DuPage that was supposed to collect everything, and everything was supposed to work, and it turned out to be just a nightmare, and it made things worse. I don't know why the state of Illinois can't get this right, but this is more of a state function than a federal function. I think the one thing that the federal government can do is to incentivize states to do a better job in terms of their reimbursements from the federal level. You know, I think it's important that the federal government at least send a message to the states that if you want help on stuff, then you should at least take care of this simple piece of business. So I have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to go here, and then this young lady's been waiting for me a long time.
Primary concerns. I recognize with the Senate makeup as it is, filibuster may be the last arrow in our quiver, but I hope you won't hesitate to use it as the Republicans did when President Clinton was attempting to nominate judges. As far as tort reform, the only thing I'd like to say about that is I represent injured people, and the effort to cap damages only affects the most injured people out there. In Texas, the largest malpractice carrier just filed papers asking for a 19% increase in premiums after they got tort reform passed in Texas. In doing so, they admitted that malpractice charges only cost them 1% of their benefits paid out. If that's only a 1% problem, my question is, why aren't we focusing on insurance regulation, on allowing Medicare to bid on prescription medicine costs so the pharmaceutical industries don't make obscene profits, and all of the other methods we can use to bring down medical care costs?
Well, it was a 2-part comment question. So with respect to the judiciary, you know, my general philosophy has been, look, the Republicans won, and the president is supposed to appoint justices and judges. And I don't expect President Bush to select the same judge that John Kerry would select or I would select. But I do expect them to appoint judges who have respect for precedent and who share a basic belief in our constitutional structure and care about civil rights and civil liberties and the right to privacy and you know, equality, basic bedrock principles. So what I've said is that, you know, I will not filibuster every judge that George Bush appoints. I may vote no, but I'll let, you know, those votes come to the floor. I would reserve the filibuster for those judges who are so radically out of step with basic norms of jurisprudence right now that I think that they would be dangerous or unqualified in the courts. You know, actually, there was a pretty good column by a columnist who said that the guiding principle for Democrats in judicial appointments should be that if they're only going to set back the clock 10 years, then you should vote for them. If they're going to set back the clock 25 years, then you should vote against them, but still let them come up for a vote. And if they're going to set back the clock 50 years, that's when you filibuster. And that may be a pretty good guidepost for where we're going judicially. But go ahead.
I have 2 sons in the military. One's active duty, one retired. With the war in Iraq, we're getting thousands of new veterans. My concern is for the veterans. President Bush does beautiful photo ops with military, and then the VA's budget is cut. When you get to Washington, would you please do all you can to help our veterans?
Well, absolutely. Look, I think it's absolutely critical. You know, I said this in my Democratic keynote speech. If we send our young men and women to war, we have an absolute obligation to make sure we're sending them based on good intelligence, that we're sending them for the right reasons, that we send them there well equipped, that we look after their families while they're gone, and that when they return, we treat them like the heroes that they are, and that is not what's been happening. This is something that we have to do something about. Now, fortunately, we've got some very good advocates in Dick Durbin and Congressman Lane Evans, and I think Congressman LaHood, who care deeply about veterans issues. And I'm hopeful that this is an area where we should at least be able to craft some bipartisan support for making sure that veterans programs are adequately funded. So.